which fell on July the 9th, 1863. They were operating outside the port as mounted infantry, so he was getting a lot of cavalry experience. The thing that brought him back to Arkansas, though, was when Little Rock fell. On September the 10th, I believe, 1863, he decided to resign from that post, come back home to move his family further south. I don't think he resigned, actually. He wanted to come home to Benton area, get his family, move them further south, and then go back. So that's what he did. When he got here to Saline County, the Union forces, probably his neighbors in the 4th Arkansas Cavalry that lived in that area, knew he was back, and so he got word that they were hiding out around his house waiting for him to come home. They knew he was going to come and try to get his family, and they were going to capture him. So he hid out in the woods watching, and finally the Union troops decided just to go in and take his family. So they took his family, his wife, his kids, a couple of their slaves, loaded them up in wagons, and he went and got some of his men who had been captured at Port Hudson and paroled and were allowed to come home, and they ambushed the party. He regained his family. He immediately took them to Columbia County, Arkansas, and he just decided right then he wasn't going back across the Mississippi River. He was going to stay here and fight, and he raised his, was allowed to raise a cavalry battalion that was known as Poe's Cavalry Battalion. Most of the men in it were his former soldiers who were released after the surrender at Port Hudson, paroled and sent home, and they just stayed here and joined his unit. So Poe's battalion was mainly Saline County men. Next slide. Okay, he moved on. They moved on down. Here's the Tulip area. This is the Old Camden Trail, or Old Military Road, that goes all the way up. But they came down, and rather than going to Tulip, he knew they would have an outpost there. He decided to come to the east and south and try to cut it off. That was the goal, the plan. When he got in this facility, they met some Confederate pickets who retreated towards Tulip and Princeton. So, next slide. He sent a small detachment into Tulip to take care of those guys while the main body moved on south towards Princeton. They were able to go through. These Confederates retreated along this road to come back into Princeton, and they had to control the road all the way down to Princeton then. But the Confederates fell back, started regrouping at Princeton under Major Poe. Of course, Colonel Logan was here with his entire brigade, but they didn't quite have the numbers that the Federals had. And as the Federals came down to Princeton, they attacked it much the way they did Benton previously. They charged into town, surrounded it, and tried to cut off any escape. But the Confederates, most of it moved about 2 miles further south. Next slide. Okay, while they were going through Princeton, looking for weapons, because it was considered an arsenal town, they tended to store weapons there. He sent a group on down to try to find the Confederates, which they found. The problem was they had a creek that was about 50 to 60 feet wide in front of them, and they didn't think it would be a wise idea to try to get across that creek to go attack them. So they were willing to go back to Princeton, do what damage they could, and prepare to move back to Little Rock. By now, they weren't just fighting with Poe, they had Logan's entire force south of Princeton. Next slide. Okay, on the retreat back to Little Rock, this would be the Confederate commander that they would deal with, Colonel John Logan. He too had been part of the 11th Arkansas. He was the company commander of Company G, which was the Camden unit, known as the Camden Knights, the second company. He was very ambitious. He gave Colonel Smith, who was the colonel, fits, trying to say that he didn't get elected properly. He was trying to become the colonel. He was always, didn't get his way in that. But he was very aggressive as well as a military and a tactician. When they were surrendering at Island 10, he and his men, were fit to be tied, but he told them, no, the general surrendered. We can't go against the word he's given them and try to escape. So they went to prison as well. When they got released from prison in August of '62, he became the new colonel of the 11th Arkansas. The men, they saw his aggressiveness and the fact that he was willing to do something, and they gave him the opportunity to lead them, which he would lead the 11th Arkansas in a lot of the battles around Port Hudson, Natchez, Mississippi, Clinton, and Jackson, Louisiana, which Jackson was a pretty big battle. When the siege at Port Hudson was going on, the Confederates were surrounded. He actually managed to break through and open up a path for them to retreat but the general in Port Hudson wouldn't, he didn't think it was well enough or bad enough that he needed to retreat yet. And so he held open that window for just a short time, and then they didn't come out, so they were all eventually surrendered like Vicksburg. But he did a number of rides where he would ride completely around the Union forces, much like Jeb Stuart did in Virginia. And he just had a small brigade of about 1,000 troops, but they created quite a bit of confusion and havoc for the Union general down around Port Hudson. Finally, the way he came back to Arkansas, he went to Virginia to see about trying to get the regiment moved back to Arkansas because the men were concerned about their families. They knew the river had been closed now, and they wanted to get back to protect their families. Don't know what happened. He was told no, but he came back to Arkansas. He didn't go back to Louisiana. He decided to come back to Arkansas anyhow. And then he got in the mix. And there's not a lot of information on how he was given his command. He wound up with like a brigade of numerous different small units. And a lot of times they refer to it as 11th Arkansas Cavalry, when really it was a hodgepodge of different units mixed together. Okay, he would be the one that would be in front of the Union forces at Hurricane Creek, almost like that first skirmish. It plays out the same way. Next slide. As the Union forces retreat down the old Camden Trail, Logan somehow manages to get out in front of them. He probably uses, since a lot of his men knew this country, that's where they lived, they knew all the little trails and shortcuts, and he managed to get in front of the Union forces who had camped about 8 miles south of Hurricane Creek, somewhere down this vicinity. When the Union forces started out, they passed a house, and people told them, said, there's a bunch of men rode through here last night, and we don't know who they were. So that let the Union Army know that something was up, so they were very cautious. And I'll talk about the battle here in a minute. Next slide. This is a little bit bigger version. I want to show, here's Hurricane Creek, here's where the road crosses. There's Hurricane Creek. Bryant would be in, I guess, this vicinity right here. Benton's over here. That road I talked about earlier, it's a Wilkerson Road that it hits Alcoa Road, pretty much comes straight in right across Hurricane Creek. Next slide. Now this is a map created just to kind of show you what went on. The Union forces came up when they crossed Hurricane Creek. They like I said, there was a lot of woods. They knew they couldn't see very far, so they were very cautious. And as they advanced, when they got completely across, they were met with Confederate forces here, and Confederate forces here, and Confederate forces on their flank. So they knew they had Confederates on both ends. So they deployed across the road facing to the east. This is where the battle occurred. There's not a lot in the battle report about it, just that the Confederates made numerous charges and attempts to overpower them. They talk about with the woods and the thickets, they really couldn't tell what was going on too far away from them. And in the confusion, at one point the Union Colonel Avery decided to charge. He had the bugler sound the charge, and for some reason some of the Confederates misunderstood it, and they got up and charged, and then wound up having to retreat. And I think the battle lasted about 45 minutes, and probably roughly 850 men, 400, 450 against each other engaged. And when it was over, the report says the Confederates fell off to their right and rear, which would mean they would have retreated back this direction. And then the Union forces immediately prepared to not hang around. They didn't want to get caught, didn't know who the force was. They knew there were some Texans involved. They knew Logan, so they weren't sure how many people were out there, how many Confederates were fixing to follow them. So they were pretty quickly to get on down the road. Now, the casualties, according to the Union report, was there were 27 Confederates killed and 1 captured, as near as they could tell. There is no Confederate report that tells how many people they had killed. That was the captain who made the report when they got back. When you see General Steele's report, he said there were 27 Confederates killed, 17 wounded, 17 captured. There was 1 Union soldier killed, and I think, I'll have to look at 8 wounded. We're talking about on the battle losses. Next slide. These are, I've got a few pictures of some of the men who were in Poe's battalion who would have been present at this battle. William Burton, Paul Wright, which he's in his reunion uniform. He's one of the few who escaped Port Hudson. He swam across the Mississippi River hanging onto a log. Arnold Wright, that's his grandpa, so he knows that story about Paul Wright. Next slide. Nathan Nall, the Nall family down towards Grant County, and Humphrey Posey Bearden. And also, all these men had been in the 11th Arkansas at one time, and then they came back this side of the river after being captured and paroled. Just thought I'd put those up there so you can see a few of the men who had fought there. Next slide. Here are the casualties that I was talking about. When they went down to Benton, they captured 2 men. At Tulip and Princeton, they captured 14 more. Then at Hurricane Creek, the Union claims 27 killed, 1 captured, or 17 captured, depending on whose report you read. I told y'all that first slide, what the marker says, there was 1 wounded, right? Okay. You look at the U.S. forces, 1 killed, 8 wounded. Now that's mighty lopsided. And they were ambushed from secret. And of course, they always embellish their reports claiming to have killed more of the enemy than they had killed. But I'm going to talk about this a little bit because it's something most people aren't aware of. Next slide. Supposedly, the Union soldiers killed some captured Confederates after they surrendered to them, according to Colonel Logan. General Magruder, who was the commander here, got involved with sending Logan to Little Rock under a flag of truce to report this to General Steele. Colonel Logan claimed he even knew what regiment they were in. And more than likely, if he did, it was probably the Kansas regiment, because the Kansas troops here in central Arkansas were pretty ruthless. There's lots of accounts, Pine Bluff area, towards Monticello. But the Kansas troops, they took a lot of liberties most of the U.S. regular forces didn't take. And I'm speculating that's probably the regiment he felt did it. Now, General Steele said he'd never given permission for his men to do that. If that had happened, he would look into it and take care of it. There's only the 2 reports, and I don't know what came of it, but that might explain why there's such a disparity of numbers in the Confederates killed versus the Union killed. Because the Union troops were not, the sides were equal, they weren't that much better armed, and it just doesn't make sense that many Confederates would be killed. And General Magruder promised Steele, though, if it kept up, that he would retaliate, and when they captured Union soldiers, they would do the same thing. Next slide. I bring this account of Mrs. Mashburn to light. This is in a book called The Confederate Women of Arkansas. This kind of helps explain some of these casualties. The Union troops didn't hang around. They fought the battle, they got reorganized, they saw the dead Confederates, the wounded where they laid, and they rode on. But she said the only battlefield, she evidently visited the battlefield right after the battle, and she said that the only one she saw was Hunter's Crossing, and that she mentions the wounded, the dying, and the dead were all lying in heaps here and there. So it was something pretty visible, where she actually saw the bodies, and she could hear the groaning, and she remembered it very well. The accounts were after that, the local women in this area took the bodies over to Bryant, what's now the Bryant Cemetery, and buried them themselves because there weren't any men around. And I had heard numerous times from people that they were buried there. And a fellow from Bryant by the name of Larry Rich talked about when he was a little boy, his mother and grandmother, they would go to decoration at the cemetery, and the big iron crosses that they would mark Confederate graves with, he remembered seeing them there, just the crosses. So that meant that there were some Confederates buried there, but when we went there to look at them, there were no iron crosses, nothing. So, next slide. Myself and a friend, Jeff Cook, we got over and got to mess around the cemetery, and we discovered, we got looking in the grass, and the only wide open spot, there were no tombstones, and there was a round concrete, like a hole had been dug, poured concrete, and in the middle, about that wide, was a piece of iron, and about that thick, that fit exactly these big iron crosses that kind of came down to a point, looked like they would stick it in the ground. They concreted them in, but somebody had broken them off. And so we got to looking for these, and we found 6 of them, which, like I said, it measured exactly with the Southern Cross